So, miracles. That's what our topic is for today. And this one was an interesting one preparing for, because I can't just make one happen. Here's a miracle. If it happens and Lord moves, amazing, and I will submit to that completely. But you can't just go here on demand, on command, let me produce a miracle for you, here and now. But I do want to share a couple of things around miracles, and before that, let me give some context for today's message. So if you haven't joined us or you've been away for the last little bit, Australian Gospel, we're just sort of going through the book of Mark, having a look at what the gospel is and how it is for us in our current context. In week 1, we looked at the different seasons of life that we find ourselves in, of preparation, calling, temptation, ministry, or team. Last week, we looked at who the good news or the gospel, the message of Jesus, who is it for? It's for everybody, for everyone, everywhere. And today, we're going to have a look at miracles. So let's have a chat to set some expectations and see where this conversation goes. First of all, let's just admit miracles are weird. They are. If they weren't weird, and if we could completely explain them, then they wouldn't be miracles. They would just be, oh, this or that. Miracles are weird. And from our modern perspective, when we look back at the biblical narratives about what they used miracles for and how miracles were done, it can be very easy to say, oh, they didn't understand the world the way that we do. And one of the things we have, which is a great thing right now in the terms of modern medicine and understanding weather phenomena and understanding the world through a scientific lens, we're able to understand and grasp so much more of our world than our ancient counterparts ever could. But that does mean we have to do something with miracles. So we either do a couple of things. We either just ignore them and go, they were from a primitive time when they didn't understand things which we now understand. Therefore, miracles are not so much miracles as to them it was like magic, but we know how the magic trick is done. That's one way that people approach miracles. Another way that people approach miracles is because we have medicine, because we have scientific understanding, because we can understand our world in a new way, miracles were something that were done before, but they've been overtaken by our modern advances in the world. That's another way people view miracles. Some people look at miracles, they look at the biblical text and say, God used to, but he doesn't anymore. That's another way people view miracles. And then there is some of us who go, miracles still happen. We see them every day. We see them in our lives. We have friends who have unexplainable stories that make even doctors and nurses go, I don't know. They're weird. But we have to do something with them because they're so prevalent in the story of the Bible that if you want to approach Jesus and look to follow him or look at his teaching, they're just there. They're everywhere. So the question is, do miracles still happen today? Yes, no, maybe. It depends how you define a miracle. For many of us, we haven't looked around and experienced someone in front of us healed. Or we haven't walked around and seen someone physically with our own eyes raised from the dead. We haven't seen someone we may have seen a YouTube video or seen someone capture something, but we're like, oh, it could have been doctored, or maybe it's out of context. And then some of us just go, just the fact I'm breathing is a miracle. So it depends how you define miracle. There are 5 things that happened this week that reminded me of the miracles of God. And my belief is that miracles do still happen. And this week, whenever you go to God and you say, God, I don't really know what to do with this, he just gives you stuff. It's just my experience again and again. And I thought, miracles, God, I can't do one, so show me where the miracles are in my life. And 5 things happened this week. 5 people came to my mind or shared their story. My neighbour. I was running around outside with my children, and I hear the neighbour next door talking to a cat, and I'm like, better go and see her. I say, hey, what's going on? Who are you talking to? And, my cat, old, blind, looking after this thing. And then she stopped and looked at me and said, have I ever told you my story? I'm like, no, you haven't told me your story. And for the next 10 minutes, she just started to share her history. And one of the things that happened in her life is that when she went in for an operation, she passed away on the table, and she had a vision of heaven. And she saw her mum there, And she shared with me that I knew God was real, and I could see my mum there. And as I walked up, she said, "It's not your time yet." And I came back, and I just know with certainty that God is there, and God is real. And I'm like, that's amazing. It's an incredible story. We had some friends over on a Friday night, and we just had like a little fire pit in the backyard, kids running around, enjoying ourselves, having a great time. And she was sharing about a recent experience where, and she's a school mum, she was sharing her experience around, she had, I forgot what it's called now, meningitis. She had meningitis, and just, she could feel herself as she was getting sicker, like she could feel herself going blind, she could feel her body shutting down. And then suddenly, just, she was just praying and singing songs to God. She was in an isolation room, and then God just healed her, and it just happened so quickly, quicker than the doctors expected it to happen. And she just goes, "It's amazing." And I was talking to her husband. I'm like, "What's that like to sit there, to be helpless, to just be like, I can't do anything?" And he's like, "Oh, it's hard." He's a very understated dude. I'm sure he was. He's like, "It's hard, but I trusted God had it, and God brought her through that. It was just incredible." Then I think of 3 other stories over my lifetime. So in Kalgoorlie, there was a doctor. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sean George. He's done some testimony stuff here and there, but he passed away while he was driving. He had a heart attack, pulled over in Kambalda, which is like half an hour out of Kalgoorlie, or Coolgardie, whichever one it is. And he passed away. And as a doctor, his wife prayed for him, and at that time, he just came back to life. And no brain damage, no nothing, incredible story. And he himself is already a huge man of faith, but he goes, "With my whole doctoring background and my medical profession, I cannot explain why I'm able to stand today and do what I do." And it's just incredible. I think of Manuel's mum, who almost passed away about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And just the healing journey from being put into a coma and having to have an ECMO machine, had to pump her blood full of oxygen, put it back into her, and then seeing where she's at now is just amazing. A huge testimony to God and his goodness, and she'll say that. And then I've also got a pastor friend who's having a baby soon, and they never thought they would have a child, and there's just like God's just doing something there in that space. So it reminded me that I can't really deny miracles because I've been surrounded by so many over my lifetime. I've had medical professionals talking with Dr. Sean George, talking with other people who just go, "I cannot explain how that happened except for outside intervention." And it's just incredible, absolutely incredible. And at the end of our message today, we're going to hear a testimony as well about that. And so apart from my personal experience, you may still be going, miracles, unsure. So what are we going to do with them? Well, I don't know if you've been online in a while, but there's some amazing fact sheets about biblical stuff. If you don't want to go and spend $60,000 and doing like biblical studies like I have and do all that silly stuff, you can go online. You get these little fact sheets. They're amazing. And I've gone against commentaries and checked them out. They're pretty accurate. Anyway, so I was having a look at this fact sheet because I was going, okay, miracles. There's my personal experience, but we've still got to deal with the fact that they're just everywhere in the Bible, and your experience may not reflect where I'm at, and you may look at my stories I shared and what I've witnessed and go, "Oh, it's just science, it's just medicine, it's just time, it's just luck, then that's fine." So let's have a look at miracles in the context of the biblical story, especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because if we follow Jesus, and if you want to follow Jesus, you're going to have to grapple with the fact that he did miracles. There's some things you can take out of the Bible here and there to try and make your worldview work, but miracles make up a large part of his story and his proof that he's from God, as we saw in that little story about the storm that stopped. Only God can do these things, but then Jesus does them as well. It shows us who he is. So in the Bible, we have 37 miracles that Jesus does. There are about 23 to do with healing, 9 that show his command over nature, 6 to do with evil spirits and delivering, and 3 where he raises another person from the dead. So you can't deny miracles mattered because they did something in his narrative that shows us who Jesus was. There's something there. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to go to Mark chapter... Let me skip forward to my notes here. We're going to go through Mark chapter 3, 4, and 5. And we're going to have a look at 3 different stories that show us some of the miracles to do with nature, to do with raising someone from the dead, and to do with healing. So, let's go to Mark chapter 3. We're going to look at verse 1 to 6. Now, the 3 stories we're looking at are the Sabbath, the storm, and the dead girl. So this first story that we have has Jesus performing a miracle at a time when he wasn't meant to. We've talked about this many times before. The religious authority wanted him to do things a certain way, and Jesus did not really comply with that. And so what we get from this first story really is, what do we do when God interrupts what we think is right, what we think is proper? So let's have a look at it together. It says, another time, Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. The Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now that to me is an astounding story. One, the fact that a healing occurred in front of them, but what's more astounding to me is their response. Jesus heals and does something, and their response is, we've got to kill him. We've got to kill him. They had a preconceived idea of how Sabbath was meant to look and be done. So their idea was that you don't work, you don't do anything, you just rest. You make sure you do all your tithing and you look after the religious stuff, but everything else is you can't do much. You've got to completely relax. Now, the point of Sabbath, this is just a quick aside, the point of Sabbath, I find, is that it shows us that God is in control, because we take a day to just go, I'm just going to trust that my work has been enough. I'm going to rest in the fact that God is with me, and then I'm going to go into my week from a point of rest. That's where I see the power of Sabbath. In fact, if you go back to the story of Genesis, when did God rest? On the 7th day. But for humans in the story, who he created on 6th, their first full day they experience is Sabbath. So they begin their lives from a point of rest. So a lot of us do work, crash. I think God's narrative is actually be present and step into. But anyway, so they had their ideas about that, what they wanted to do, how they wanted it to work. And Jesus came in and he did something which they did not approve of, and so they plot to kill him. And you can see Jesus' anger there, because he's gone to them with a pretty simple question. Do you think God wants a good outcome for a person on this day, or do you think he wants a bad outcome? And they were so behind there, it has to be done this way. They were happy to not answer and be like, and then when they saw him do something good, they got angry. And they wanted to kill him. They plotted to kill him. So what do you and I do when God interrupts? Hopefully we make a better decision than they did. Let's go to the next one, 4:35 to 41. This is the story that we just heard. Let's have a look at this. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat, and it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. I like how they say it, sleeping on a cushion. He was chilling. And the disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." The wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And what does verse 41 say? They were terrified. They were scared they were going to die, and now they're even more scared because they can see they witnessed something which is beyond their understanding. So they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, a quick aside in this story, there were other boats with them. I hope they're okay. Like, they didn't mention anything. So did they see the miracle happen? Were they like just swept apart? I hope they're fine. Anyway, the story doesn't say. It just tells us that there were boats and then doesn't mention them from that point. So, Jesus has authority over creation, over nature. He could do something which they said is impossible. Only God can do that. The one who created everything, who's over everything, is through everything. He made the wind. He made the waves. He made the world. And then Jesus is there in a human body, and his words can bring nature under submission. Isn't that amazing? It shows God's authority, that those who follow him are following someone whose story matches the walk. Again and again in the miracles of Jesus, what is abundantly clear is that Jesus is not only saying the right thing and directing God's people and future God's people to where we need to be in our relationship to God, he's backing it up by saying, yeah, I can forgive sins. My teaching is worth following. I speak, when I say things on behalf of God, I mean they are on behalf of God. Here's how you know you can trust me. I can heal. I can control nature. And I don't know about you, but if someone was able to, with their words, control the weather, I'd probably follow them, because that's pretty amazing. Now, there's actually a little thing that happens in this story which someone notes, and I won't get too hung up on it, but I just think it's really neat. In this little episode, there's actually sort of a parallel with Jesus' death and resurrection. So you have Jesus asleep on the boat, and then when you fast forward, he passes away and dies on the cross. The disciples, when he's on the boat, they freak out. What are we going to do? The storm is around us. Jesus is not waking up. What's going on? You fast forward, Jesus passes away on the cross. The disciples start to freak out. What are we going to do? Jesus is gone. What's happening? The storm is all around them. You have Jesus awaken. He just wakes up from a sleep. You have Jesus rise from the dead, from the tomb. And then you have Jesus' awakening quiet the storm. And then over this side, Jesus' resurrection quiets death. It's just like a nice little story within a story that sort of points forward to what's going to happen. So Jesus calms the storm. Let's have a look at our final passage. Mark chapter 5, 21 to 42, and I've taken out the middle part of the story because I'll explain as we go. 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat, lots of miracles and boats going on, to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake, because he's healing, he's doing things. The crowd want to be around him. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came down and saw Jesus and fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and she will live." So Jesus went with him. Now, the next little part of the story, Jesus heals a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. And it's sort of interesting. The little girl's young and 12 years old, and the lady has been bleeding for 12 years, and there's a healing, so it's sort of like a little nod in there between the two stories and how they're linked. But what's important is that Jesus rocks up. This synagogue leader comes and, driven by the desire to see Jesus heal his daughter, just pleads and says, "You've got to come, teacher, you've got to come." And as they're on their way, another miracle occurs. But while they've been doing that, this is what happens. While Jesus was still speaking, so after healing the lady, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and said, "Your daughter is dead." They said, "Why bother the teacher any longer?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, people crying and wailing loudly. And he went in and said to them, "What is this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. Now, when I was having a read of this, I always thought they laughed at him. I'm like, that's a bit callous, isn't it? Like, the daughter's dead, they're wailing, and then Jesus says, "What are you doing? Why is this commotion? Why have you begun the funeral procession? She's not dead, she's asleep." and they start to laugh. And when I had a look into the background behind it, the people coming, crying and wailing sort of shows that the beginning of the funeral arrangements had begun. So when there's a death, they would get people to come in and cry and wail and make noise, and just to help the family in the grieving process. So that had already started, and they had already started this, she's dead, she's gone, and we've got to make sure things happen that help the family grieve and move on with their lives. And Jesus says, no, she's not dead. And they go, well, we're here. We've started this, she must be dead. So he put them all out. He's like, get out of here. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and he said to her, Talitha Kum, I don't really know how to say it probably. And it says, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up, began to walk around. She was 12 years old, like the lady, how long she'd been bleeding for. And at this time they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to tell anyone about this and to give her something to eat. Now it's interesting there that there's an Aramaic expression. So when they were writing this down and they thought, we need to capture this for future generations and future people, there's something about this phrase that's important. There's something about it that's special, that they wanted to keep it in its original phrase. I think it's a sign of intimacy. Every commentary has a different answer. But the thing I have resonated with, and I found in a couple of them, was sort of around the idea that it's sort of saying Jesus' heart for the girl, his love for her. So they didn't translate it into the other written, they kept it in the local tongue to show that there's an intimacy there. There's something special about this phrase, the way that Jesus spoke it, that needs to be captured and put in the story for us to read and go, something special. Like we got to look at that and say, in that original tongue, that's how he said, little girl, get up. Anyway. So what do we see in this story? We see that Jesus has the power over death. Yes, he can heal a person who is alive. So we verified that. Not everyone's always happy when he does it, but he can do it. We verified he can control nature through the story, but he can also overcome death. And the reason I believe these stories to be true is because of the witnesses and the way the story has been put together. And then tie what I read here and what I see here, and you have to go on your own journey to figure this out for yourself, but what I see here in the story and what I experience in life when I talk to people who have been through miraculous, I see the work of God the same today as it was back then. For me, when I see the gift of healing in people, and when I see people who are able to produce the gift of healing, one of the things that I'm very certain of is the gift of healing is almost, it's a gift of proclamation. Proclaiming the work that God and only God can do. Humans don't heal humans. We might be there to announce it. We might pray over people. We may have our faith stand in place for them so that they may be healed. We saw that last week with the paralyzed man being brought before Jesus. It was the faith of the people who brought him that stood in the gap, and Jesus was able to heal him. I believe that we can do that for one another, pray for one another, have our faith stand in their place while they may not be strong. But it's God who heals, and we're just there to witness what God and only God can do.